You ever hear a machine refuse to die, but also refuse to live? The voice cut through the heavy summer air as a low, frustrated murmur rippled across the rail yard, where the Union Pacific big boy sat like a grounded giant. 132 feet of steel and memory locked in silence under the harsh midday sun, its black iron skin shimmering in waves of heat rising off the tracks, its massive driving wheels frozen as if time itself had reached out and held them in place, and around it, a swarm of engineers in bright vests and clean gloves moved with growing agitation. Their boots crunching over gravel, their radios crackling with clipped, impatient updates, laptops open on folding tables displaying neat rows of green diagnostics that insisted everything was fine, everything was operational, everything was ready, and yet the locomotive did not move, not an inch, not a breath, not even the faintest tremor of life, as Kyle Bennett, lead engineer, 31 years old, and at the top of every certification list that mattered, wiped a line of sweat from his brow, and slammed his palm against the warm steel of the side panel, the dull thud echoing back at him like a quiet refusal. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, jaw tightening. "You should be running." While just beyond the cordon barrier, a crowd had begun to gather, families with phones raised, rail enthusiasts whispering in disbelief. A few local reporters adjusting their cameras as the countdown clock for the public demonstration ticked steadily downward. Less than 10 minutes now, and the pressure was no longer just mechanical. It was public, it was visible, it was suffocating. Lieutenant Ryan Cole paced nearby, his crisp uniform already losing its sharpness under the heat and the stress, his voice sharp as he barked into a radio. "Diagnostics check again. I don't care if it says green, something's wrong." But the replies came back the same, controlled, confused, and increasingly uncertain. And through it all, unnoticed at first, an old man stood quietly behind the outer rail, hands tucked into the pockets of a faded brown jacket that looked like it had seen more winters than anyone present. His posture relaxed but not weak, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the frantic movement of people, but on the locomotive itself, studying it with a stillness that didn't belong in the chaos, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, the distant hiss of residual steam escaping somewhere deep within the machine, a soft, uneven breath that others dismissed as leftover pressure. But to him, it was something else, something familiar, something wrong, and as a gust of dry wind pushed across the yard, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of heated iron, the old man's gaze narrowed just slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, like a memory rising uninvited to the surface. While Kyle kicked lightly at the base of one of the massive wheels in frustration, "It's dead," he said louder this time, turning toward his team with a forced confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Completely dead." And a few of the younger technicians nodded, though their expressions betrayed doubt. Because nothing about the machine looked dead. It looked waiting, like a held breath stretched too long, like a story paused in the middle of a sentence. And somewhere behind them, just beyond the barrier, the old man took a single slow step forward, gravel shifting beneath his worn boots, his attention locked on the silent giant, as if, in that moment, the noise of the yard, the voices, the radios, the ticking clock, all of it had faded away, leaving only him and the machine that refused to move. The seconds kept slipping away, each one louder than the last as the countdown clock blinked in red above the temporary control station. 9 minutes, then 8, and the air around the locomotive grew heavier, thick with the quiet panic of professionals running out of answers, while Kyle Bennett crouched near an open-access panel, fingers moving quickly across a diagnostic tablet, scrolling through lines of data that refused to explain what his eyes were telling him. Every system reported stable, boiler pressure within acceptable limits, fuel flow normal, mechanical linkages responsive, and yet the machine remained still, as if it had made a decision no software could override. And behind him, Lieutenant Ryan Cole exhaled sharply, pacing again with shorter, tighter steps, his voice cutting through the noise as he snapped, "Run it again." And one of the technicians hesitated before responding, "Sir, we already did. 3 times?" Which only made Cole's jaw clench harder, because repetition was supposed to fix uncertainty, not deepen it, while a low, uneven hiss slipped from somewhere beneath the massive boiler. a thin ribbon of steam escaping into the sunlight, twisting upward like a signal. No one had learned how to read, except one man, who now stood just a few feet closer to the barrier, his eyes following that faint release with quiet precision. Arthur Hayes did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not announce himself. He simply watched, his head tilting slightly, as if aligning himself with a rhythm the others were too distracted to notice. And for a brief moment his gaze dropped to the tracks beneath the locomotive, to the subtle shimmer of heat and the almost imperceptible vibration that pulsed through the steel rails, a vibration that should have built into motion but instead faded into nothing, like a heartbeat that could not find its next beat. And he exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but steady, grounded, as if he had heard this silence before, as if he recognized the difference between a machine that was broken and a machine that was resisting. While back at the control station, a technician called out, "Pressure is holding at 295 pounds per square inch." And Kyle responded without looking up, "Then why is she not moving?" His voice lower now, less certain, because the question was no longer technical. It was personal. The machine was defying him, defying everything he had been trained to trust. And somewhere in that growing tension, Emily Carter stood slightly apart from the others, her tablet held loosely at her side, her attention drifting away from the numbers and toward the old man by the barrier. Something about him did not fit the pattern, not the way he stood, not the way he looked at the locomotive, not like a spectator, but like someone waiting for it to speak, and she found herself watching him instead of the screen, noticing how his eyes tracked the escaping steam, how his shoulders remained completely still while everything else moved, and a thought flickered across her mind, quiet but persistent, that maybe the problem was not in the data they were reading, but in something they were not listening to. And as the clock dropped to 7 minutes, a gust of wind swept across the yard, carrying with it a deeper groan from within the locomotive, a strained metallic sound that rolled through the massive frame like a warning, drawing a few uneasy glances from the crew, but dismissed just as quickly as background noise, except for Arthur Hayes, who took one more step forward, his boots stopping just short of the boundary line, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, and in a voice low enough that it barely rose above the hiss of steam, he spoke, not to the people, but to the machine. "That is not failure," he murmured. "That is hesitation." Emily did not realize she had started walking until the gravel shifted under her boots and the sound pulled a few glances in her direction, including Kyle's, who straightened from the open panel with a look that was equal parts irritation and urgency. "Where are you going?" he asked, not loudly, but with the kind of edge that carried across the noise, and she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "I just need to check something," which was not entirely untrue, though it was not the whole truth either. Because what she was really following was not a reading or a protocol, but a feeling that had been building since she noticed the old man's gaze, steady and unshaken while everything else was unraveling. And as she approached the barrier, she could hear the faint murmur of the crowd behind it, the soft clicks of cameras, the low conversations that carried a tone of growing doubt, while the old man remained exactly where he was, his attention still fixed on the locomotive, as if the world around him had narrowed down to that single, silent engine. And when Emily stopped a few feet away, she cleared her throat lightly, unsure why she suddenly felt like she was the one out of place. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice respectful but controlled, "you cannot stand this close to the restricted area." And for a moment she thought he might not respond at all, but then he turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. And there was something in that look that made her forget the next line she had planned to say. Not authority, not defiance, but a calm that felt older than the situation, older than the machine itself. "You are listening to the wrong things," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady, and Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me," she replied, and he shifted his gaze back toward the locomotive. "You are watching numbers," he continued, "but she is not speaking in numbers right now." And Emily felt a flicker of resistance rise in her chest, the trained part of her mind pushing back against what sounded like nothing more than poetic nonsense. But at the same time, another part of her, quieter and harder to ignore, recognized that he was not guessing, he was certain, and that certainty did not come from arrogance. It came from familiarity, the kind that could not be taught in a classroom or downloaded into a tablet. And behind her, Kyle called out again, sharper this time. Emily, I need that pressure cross-check now. And she turned halfway, torn between two directions, between protocol and instinct, between the noise of urgency and the silence of something she did not yet understand. While the old man spoke again, softer this time, almost as if he was continuing a conversation with the machine itself. She is holding back, he murmured. Pressure is there, but it is not flowing the way it should. And Emily's eyes dropped to her tablet almost reflexively, her fingers moving across the screen to pull up the pressure distribution logs. And for a moment, everything looked normal, stable, consistent, exactly as it had been reported. But then she zoomed in, narrowing the data, isolating the micro fluctuations that were usually ignored because they fell within acceptable tolerance. And her breath caught slightly as she noticed the pattern, a subtle oscillation, a delay between input and response that was small enough to dismiss, but consistent enough to mean something. And she looked back up at him, this time with a different expression, one that carried the beginning of belief. How did you see that? She asked, her voice lower now. And he did not answer right away, his eyes still on the locomotive. I did not see it, he said after a moment. I felt it. And the simplicity of that answer settled over her heavier than any technical explanation could have, because it meant the gap between them was not knowledge, it was experience, and behind them, the clock dropped to 6 minutes, and the tension in the yard tightened like a wire pulled too far, while Kyle's voice rose again, sharper, more urgent. Emily, now. And this time when she turned back toward him, there was something new in her posture, not defiance, but decision. Because for the first time since the problem began, she was no longer completely sure that the answers were coming from the direction they had been looking. The shift in Emily's posture did not go unnoticed, especially not by Kyle Bennett, who had spent the last 10 minutes fighting a machine that refused to obey him. And when he saw her standing near the barrier instead of at her station, something in him snapped tighter, not out of anger alone, but out of pressure, the kind that builds when control begins to slip through your fingers. Emily, he called again, this time louder, sharper, the edge no longer hidden. I said I need that cross-check. Now. And the surrounding crew fell slightly quieter, sensing the tension threading through his voice, while Lieutenant Ryan Cole turned his head, tracking the exchange with narrowed eyes, already primed for confrontation, and Emily took a slow breath before stepping away from the barrier, her mind moving faster than her feet, replaying the old man's words, the pattern she had just seen in the data, the subtle hesitation in the system that no one else had acknowledged. And as she reached Kyle, she held out the tablet, her voice steady but different now, less reactive, more certain. The pressure is not wrong, she said, but it is not distributing evenly. And Kyle frowned immediately, taking the device from her with a quick motion, scanning the display. It is. Within tolerance, he replied almost instantly, the words automatic, trained, but Emily did not back down this time. Look closer, she said, pointing to the micro fluctuations. There is a delay, a lag between the intake and the response. It is cycling, like it cannot decide where to go. And Kyle's jaw tightened as he zoomed in, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment the noise around them seemed to dim as he focused, seeing what she was pointing at, the pattern subtle but undeniably there. And yet instead of relief, it only deepened the problem, because it did not explain the cause. It only confirmed the symptom, and behind them, the old man's voice carried just enough to reach, calm, unhurried. She is choking on her own steam, he said, and that was the moment Lieutenant Cole stepped forward, his patience finally giving way. All right, that is enough, he snapped, moving toward the barrier with purpose. Sir, you need to step back. This is a restricted operational zone, his tone. Firm, authoritative, the kind that expected immediate compliance. But Arthur Hayes did not move. He simply looked at the locomotive, then at the officer, his expression unchanged. You are forcing her, he said quietly, and she does not trust your timing. And Cole let out a short, incredulous breath, glancing back at Kyle as if to confirm what he was hearing. Trust, he repeated, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. It is a machine. And Arthur gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. No, he replied. It is a system that remembers pressure. And the words hung there, strange and out of place among the technical language. And yet Emily felt them land with a weight she could not ignore, because they aligned with what she had just seen: the hesitation, the delay, the imbalance that looked less like failure and more like resistance. While Kyle straightened slowly, still holding the tablet, his mind working through possibilities, recalculating, reassessing, but the clock above them dropped to 5 minutes, the red numbers flashing with increasing urgency, and the distant murmur of the crowd grew louder, expectation turning into doubt, cameras still raised but no longer steady, and Cole's frustration sharpened further. "We do not have time for this," he said, stepping closer to the barrier, his voice lower now, but more intense. "Sir, step back or I will have you escorted out." And for the first time, Arthur Hayes shifted his stance slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just grounding himself, his eyes returning to the locomotive as a deeper groan rolled through its frame, the sound longer this time, heavier, like a breath that could not fully release. And he spoke again, not louder, but clearer, each word measured. "Open the secondary relief before you build pressure again." And Kyle's head snapped toward him, the sentence cutting through the noise like a clean line, because that was not guesswork, that was specific, precise, and for a split second, something unspoken passed between them, recognition not of identity, but of understanding, and it unsettled him more than the failure itself. For a moment, no one moved, not because they agreed, but because the certainty in Arthur Hayes's voice did not sound like a suggestion, it sounded like memory, and Kyle Bennett felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift in the air when doubt begins to turn into something else, something closer to curiosity, or maybe even concern, and his eyes flicked from the old man to the tablet in his hands, then back again, replaying the sentence in his mind. "Open the secondary relief before you. Build pressure again." It was not a vague idea. It was a sequence, a correction, and the part that unsettled him most was not that it might be right, but that he had not considered it himself. While Lieutenant Ryan Cole exhaled sharply beside him, the sound edged with impatience. "We are not taking operational advice from a bystander," he said, his tone firm, almost rehearsed, as if repeating the line would reinforce control. But Kyle did not respond immediately, his attention already drifting back to the locomotive, to the deep, uneven groan that rolled through its frame again, longer this time, followed by a brief, sharp hiss that cut off too quickly, like a breath interrupted, and something in that pattern aligned with what Emily had shown him. The lag, the imbalance, the pressure holding but not moving the way it should, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he handed the tablet back to her, his voice lower now, more focused. "Show me the secondary relief readings." And Emily did not hesitate, her fingers already moving across the screen, pulling up the subsystem data that most of the team had ignored because it had not triggered any alerts. And as the numbers populated, Kyle leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he traced the flow, the intake, the distribution, the release. And there it was, subtle, buried beneath layers of acceptable tolerance, a minor restriction in the relief cycle, not enough to flag, not enough to fail, but enough to disrupt the rhythm of the entire system. And he felt a tightness form in his chest, not panic, but realization, because if that restriction was mistimed, if the pressure was being held back even slightly at the wrong moment, it could create exactly what they were seeing, a system that looked stable but refused to move. And behind them, Cole shook his head, stepping closer, his voice rising again. "Kyle, we do not have time for theory, we need action." But this time Kyle did not look at him, his gaze fixed on the locomotive, on the faint shimmer of heat along its massive body, on the slow, uneven release of steam that now seemed less random and more like a signal he had been ignoring. And for the first time since the problem began, he spoke not as a man defending his expertise, but as one questioning it. "What if it is not broken?" he said quietly, almost to himself, and Emily glanced at him, recognizing the shift instantly, because that was the moment when certainty gives way to understanding, and it changes everything. While beyond the barrier, Arthur Hayes remained still, his eyes never leaving the machine, his presence steady, unforced, as if he had already seen this outcome play out long before anyone else realized there was a problem. And the clock dropped to 4 minutes, the red numbers flashing faster now, louder in their silence, while the crowd's murmur swelled into something heavier, anticipation mixed with doubt, and Kyle took a slow breath, then another hiss. shoulders settling as he made a decision that went against every instinct of control he had held on to since the start. "We checked the secondary relief," he said, louder now, clear, decisive, and a few of the technicians exchanged quick glances before moving, their motions faster, sharper, driven by a direction that finally felt grounded, while Cole stared at him for a second longer, disbelief flickering across his face. "You are seriously doing this," he said, and Kyle finally looked at him, not defensive, not aggressive, just certain in a different way than before. "We are out of options," he replied. Then after a brief pause, added, "And he is not guessing." And that was the first time the balance shifted, not in the machine, not yet, but in the people around it. Because the moment someone acknowledges that they might be wrong, the entire system begins to change. The shift moved faster now, carried not by confidence but by urgency, as technicians broke into motion around the locomotive, tools clinking against steel, gloves tightening, radios crackling with short, clipped confirmations, while Emily crouched beside the open panel, her tablet balanced against her knee as she guided two crew members toward the secondary relief system. "Valve assembly is just beneath the main intake line," she said, her voice steady despite the rising pressure in the air. And one of the technicians hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching in, his fingers brushing against the metal housing. "It is warm," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, and Emily nodded. "It should be, but check the movement." And he applied a careful turn, slow at first, then slightly firmer, and the response came with resistance, not a hard stop, but a drag, subtle, inconsistent, like something inside was holding back, while behind them Kyle Bennett stood with his arms crossed, not in dismissal, but in concentration, his eyes tracking every motion, every reaction, his mind recalibrating in real time. And somewhere beyond the barrier, Arthur Hayes watched without moving, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if the outcome was already written and he was simply waiting for the others to catch up to it. While Lieutenant Ryan Cole remained tense, his posture rigid, his jaw set, watching the operation with a mix of frustration and disbelief, as if the very act of following the old man's suggestion was an admission he was not ready to make. And above them the clock dropped to 3 minutes, the red digits blinking faster, louder, the weight of expectation pressing down from every direction, cameras still rolling, voices in the crowd rising in uncertain waves. And then it happened. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with a subtle shift that only those closest could feel. The technician working the valve paused mid-motion, his hand still on the metal, his head tilting slightly as he felt the resistance change. "It just loosened," he said, his voice quieter now, surprised, and Emily leaned in closer, her eyes fixed on the mechanism. "Do it again," she instructed, and this time when he adjusted the valve, the movement flowed more smoothly, not perfect, but different, freer. And a low, deeper hiss answered from within the locomotive, longer than before, fuller, as if something inside had finally found space to move. And Kyle's head lifted slightly at the sound, his attention sharpening, because this was not random, this was response. And for the first time since the problem began, the machine was answering them. While Arthur Hayes took one slow step closer to the barrier, his voice carrying just enough to reach. Calm, unhurried. "Now build it again," slowly he said, and Kyle did not hesitate this time, his voice cutting through the noise with new clarity. Increase pressure, gradual rise, no spikes. And the crew responded instantly, hands moving across controls, adjustments made with precision instead of force, and the locomotive answered, not with motion yet, but with presence, the deep internal rhythm shifting, aligning, the uneven groan smoothing into something steadier, something closer to life, while the rails beneath it began to hum, faint at first, then stronger, a vibration that spread outward through the steel like a pulse returning after a long pause. And Emily felt it through the ground, through her boots, her breath catching slightly as she looked up at Kyle, and this time he did not look uncertain. He looked focused, locked in, as if he had finally stepped into the same conversation the old man had been having all along. And behind them, Cole remained silent, the first cracks of doubt settling in, because the machine that had refused them for nearly an hour was now beginning to respond to a sequence none of them had considered, and the clock dropped to 2 minutes. But for the first time, It no longer felt like a countdown to failure. It felt like a race they might actually win. The vibration deepened beneath their feet. No longer a faint suggestion, but a steady pulse that rolled through the rails and up into the massive frame of the locomotive. And every person close enough to feel it instinctively stilled, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever fragile alignment had finally begun to form. While Kyle Bennett raised a hand slightly, not as a command, but as a signal. "Hold it there," he said. His voice controlled, measured, his eyes fixed on the pressure gauge as it climbed in a slow, deliberate rise. 298, 299, 300 pounds per square inch. And this time the number did not feel like a static reading. It felt alive, connected, part of a system that was finally moving as one, and a deeper sound answered from within the locomotive. Not a groan, not a strain, but a low, resonant hum that seemed to settle into the steel like a memory returning to its place, while Emily remained crouched near the panel, her hand still resting lightly against the metal housing, feeling the subtle changes through her fingertips, the rhythm smoothing, the hesitation fading, and she glanced toward the barrier almost without thinking, her eyes finding Arthur Hayes, who stood exactly as before, calm, grounded, his gaze steady, and for the first time she understood that he was not watching for confirmation. He was waiting for the moment they would stop interfering, because that was the final step, not adding more, but stepping back, and as if reading the same realization, Arthur spoke again, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "Do not force the throttle," he said. "Let her take it." And Kyle did not argue, did not question. He simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before turning slightly toward the control station. "Ease it forward," he called. No sudden input, and the operator at the controls responded with careful precision, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, adjusting the throttle with a restraint that went against every instinct of urgency pressing down on them. And for a moment, nothing happened. The locomotive remained still, the hum steady but contained, and the clock above them dropped to 1 minute, the red numbers flashing with relentless indifference, while the crowd's murmur rose into a tense, uncertain silence. Phones held higher now, waiting, recording, and then the sound changed, not louder, but deeper, a shift in tone that rolled through the boiler like a breath finally released, followed by a sharp, clean hiss as steam vented in a controlled burst from the side, white against the dark steel, and the massive wheels gave the slightest movement, so small it could have been missed if not for the sudden intake of breath from those closest, and Kyle leaned forward just slightly, his focus absolute, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Again," he said, and the throttle adjusted another fraction, and this time the response was unmistakable. The wheels turned, slowly at first, heavy, deliberate, the kind of movement that carried weight and history in equal measure, and the entire locomotive seemed to wake in stages, the hum rising, the vibration strengthening, the steel frame settling into motion with a controlled power that did not rush, did not lurch, but advanced with quiet authority, and no one spoke, not Kyle, not Emily, not even Lieutenant Cole, whose rigid stance had softened just enough to reveal something new beneath it, not defeat, not exactly, but the beginning of respect, because what they were witnessing was not just a machine coming back to life. It was the unraveling of certainty, the realization that everything they had relied on had not been wrong, just incomplete, and beyond the barrier. Arthur Hayes finally shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just acknowledging the moment with a subtle exhale, his eyes still on the locomotive as it moved, steady, controlled, exactly as it was meant to, as if it had only been waiting for someone to remember how to listen. The motion did not surge, it unfolded, slow and deliberate, as if the locomotive itself was reclaiming something it had been denied. Each turn of the massive wheels carrying a weight that was no longer resistance but purpose, and the deep rhythmic chuff began to build, steady and controlled, pushing against the air in measured intervals that echoed across the yard, while the long plume of white steam rose clean and strong from the stack, no longer erratic, no longer strained, but aligned, and, for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment demanded silence, the kind that settles when something undeniable has just happened, and Kyle Bennett stood at the edge of the control area, his posture still, his eyes locked on the moving engine, not with relief, not yet, but with a quiet recalibration of everything he thought he understood, as if the success in front of him was rewriting the rules he had trusted for years, while Emily Carter slowly rose. From her position near the panel, brushing a trace of dust from her gloves without taking her eyes off the locomotive, feeling the steady vibration now pulsing through the ground with a consistency that had been absent before, and she let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding, her gaze drifting once more toward the barrier, toward the man who had never raised his voice, never insisted, never demanded, and yet had shifted the entire outcome with a handful of words spoken at the right moment. While Lieutenant Ryan Cole remained where he was, his rigid stance softening just enough to reveal the internal shift beneath it, the tension giving way to something quieter, something harder to admit, because the authority he had relied on had not been enough, and that realization settled heavier than any failure could have, and beyond the operational line, the crowd began to react, not in a sudden burst, but in a rising wave of sound. Murmurs turning into exclamations, phones lifting higher, cameras tracking the movement of the locomotive as it rolled forward along the tracks, its presence filling the space with a kind of gravity that demanded attention. And somewhere in that growing noise, a voice from the control station broke through, "We are live." And another answered, "She is running clean." And the confirmation spread quickly through the crew, but it did not bring the expected release of celebration. Instead, it deepened the silence among those closest, because they knew how close it had come to going the other way, how easily this moment could have been something else entirely. And Kyle finally moved, stepping away from the control panel, his eyes shifting toward the barrier, toward Arthur Hayes, who stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. And for a brief second, the noise of the yard seemed to fade again, the movement of the train continuing in the background while the focus narrowed to that single point, the space between the man who had solved the problem and the ones who had not known how. And Kyle took a step in that direction, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a deliberate pace that matched the tone of everything that had just happened. And Emily watched him go, understanding without needing to be told that this was not just about acknowledgement. It was about correction, about recognizing that the solution had not come from more control, more pressure, or more certainty, but from something older, quieter, and far more precise. And as the locomotive continued to move, steady and alive, the balance of the entire scene had shifted, not just in motion, but in meaning, because what had been dismissed as outdated had just proven itself indispensable, and the difference between those two truths now stood clearly, quietly, in the form of a single man who had never needed to prove anything at all. The distance between them closed slowly, not out of urgency, but out of recognition, as Kyle Bennett stepped across the gravel with measured intent, the steady rhythm of the locomotive continuing behind him, its wheels turning with quiet authority, its breath now even, controlled, alive. And for the first time since the chaos began, he was not looking at the machine, he was looking at the man who had understood it before anyone else did, while Emily remained a few steps behind, watching, her arms resting loosely at her sides, her eyes moving between the two, sensing the weight of what was about to happen. And Lieutenant Ryan Cole stood farther back, his posture no longer rigid, his silence no longer defensive, but reflective, as if the moment had shifted something deeper than protocol, something harder to name. And when Kyle reached the barrier, he stopped, not too close, not too far, leaving just enough space to acknowledge without imposing. And for a second, neither of them spoke, the noise of the crowd swelling in the background, the sound of cameras clicking, voices rising. But here, in this small space, it felt distant, irrelevant, as if the only thing that mattered was the quiet understanding that had formed between them. And Kyle finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before, stripped of the edge it once carried. "You knew," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. And Arthur Hayes did not respond immediately, his eyes drifting briefly toward the moving locomotive, then back again, his expression unchanged. "I have heard that sound before," he said simply, and Kyle gave a small nod, the kind that comes when something finally settles into place, when Resistance gives way to acceptance. We missed it, he admitted, the words not easy, but necessary, and Arthur's gaze softened just slightly, not in approval, not in correction, but in quiet acknowledgement. You were not listening for it, he replied, and there was no judgment in the statement. Only truth, the kind that does not need to be defended, and Kyle let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing for the first time. No, he said, we were not. And for a brief moment, the two men stood there, separated by a simple barrier, connected by something far more complex, the difference between knowing and understanding, between control and experience, and behind them, the locomotive continued forward, its presence filling the yard with a steady, undeniable force, drawing cheers now from the crowd, applause rising in waves, but neither of them turned toward it, because the moment they were in did not belong to the noise. It belonged to the silence that had made it possible, and Emily stepped closer then, just enough to be heard, her voice carrying a quiet respect that had not been there before. Sir, she said, and Arthur looked at her. Thank you. And he gave a small nod, nothing more, as if the words were not necessary, as if the outcome had already said everything that needed to be said, and Kyle hesitated for a fraction of a second, then extended his hand across the barrier, not as a formality, but as a recognition, and Arthur looked at it briefly before taking it, his grip firm despite the years, steady in a way that spoke of a life built on repetition and precision, and there were no speeches, no explanations, no attempt to define what had just happened, because it did not need to be defined. It only needed to be remembered, and as they released their hands, Arthur stepped back slightly, returning to the quiet space he had occupied from the beginning, his presence already beginning to fade into the background of the moment he had shaped, while Kyle turned slowly, his gaze returning to the locomotive. But this time it was different, not as a problem to be solved, but as something to be understood, and the sound of its steady movement filled the air, carrying with it a lesson that would not be written in any manual, not stored in any system, but carried forward in a quieter way, the kind that stays long after the noise fades, because some knowledge is not taught, it is remembered, and some respect is not demanded, it is earned in silence.